At a family dinner, my father looked me straight in the eye and said, "You were a mistake." They laughed when I started my own business. They stole my work. They erased me from the company I helped build. Hi, I'm Elena. And today, I control every dollar that keeps their empire alive. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or pushed aside by the very people who were supposed to believe in you, you're going to want to hear what happened next. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to prove your worth to the people who doubted you most? It's funny how an email can ruin your whole week. The message from my mother popped up on a rainy Thursday afternoon, stark and emotionless. Sunday dinner. Formal. Important. I sat there, staring at it for longer than I should have, my coffee cooling by the second. The last time she labeled a dinner important, I walked into a celebration I hadn't been invited to plan, where my brother Brandon had been handed a promotion I didn't even know he was being considered for. They called it a family achievement. I called it a polite ambush wrapped in champagne flutes and careful smiles. Still, some stubborn part of me, some piece that hadn't fully given up, whispered maybe this time would be different. Maybe after everything I had built, after all the numbers I had turned from red to black for them, they would finally see me. Hope, I've learned, is a quiet kind of foolishness. It doesn't shout. It taps you gently on the shoulder when you least expect it. Sunday came wrapped in a stubborn drizzle that clung to the sidewalks and smeared the city skyline into muted grays. I wore navy, structured, understated, safe, and pulled my hair into a low chignon, the way Victoria preferred. Formal, after all. Driving up the long, tree-lined street toward the Morgan estate felt like stepping into a memory I hadn't asked to relive. The towering white columns, the manicured hedges that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Even the brick driveway glistened under the rain like polished glass. I parked, inhaled slowly, and reminded myself, you deserve to be here. You've earned this. The front door swung open before I could even ring the bell. Victoria stood framed by the golden light of the chandeliered entryway, a vision of control in a sleek cream dress and pearls. "Elena," she said, her voice warm but clipped, "you're early." Traffic was lighter than I expected, I offered. A lie, but one she would appreciate. She smiled, the kind that never quite reached her eyes, and ushered me inside. The scent of roasted lamb and rosemary filled the air, familiar yet somehow distant, like a childhood song you can't fully remember the words to. Brandon was already at the table, his tie loosened, swirling a glass of red wine like he was auditioning for a magazine cover. He looked up and grinned, lazy and unbothered. "Hey, sis, you made it." There was a casualness to his tone that made my skin itch, like he knew something I didn't. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, weather, work, vague updates no one really cared about. My father, Richard, appeared moments later, carrying a bottle of wine he didn't offer to pour. He nodded at me once, the way you nod at a colleague you're obligated to acknowledge, not a daughter you love. Dinner began with the kind of forced conversation that feels like walking a tightrope made of old family expectations. I answered every question politely, smiled when prompted, and tried not to notice how Brandon dominated the table, regaling them with stories about big opportunities he was pursuing. Vague, of course. Always vague. Victoria beamed at him like he'd cured cancer. I sipped my water, straightened the silverware in front of me for the third time, and forced myself to stay present. This is my chance, I reminded myself. My moment to speak up. The rain tapped harder against the tall windows, a soft, persistent drumbeat. I waited for a pause, a crack in the conversation wide enough to slip through without being immediately drowned out. Finally, as Brandon launched into another story about a potential partnership he was leading negotiations for, I set my fork down, took a breath, and spoke. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice even, "I think I've earned the right to ask, why was I never considered for leadership?" The room stilled. Even the rain seemed to hush. Richard didn't frown. He didn't sigh or shift uncomfortably. He simply looked at me, his face unreadable, and answered with a voice so casual it almost didn't feel cruel. "Because you were a mistake," he said. No drama, no hesitation, just a simple clinical fact laid bare on the table between us. I felt the world tilt slightly under my feet. Across the table, Brandon smirked into his wine glass. Victoria dabbed her mouth with her napkin, composed as ever, as if her husband hadn't just carved a hole straight through me with a handful of words. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the soft clink of Brandon setting his glass down. I stared at Richard, waiting for a punchline that didn't come, for a telltale flicker of regret that never crossed his face. There was only certainty, cool and final, like a judge reading a sentence already decided. Somewhere deep inside, something brittle cracked. I straightened my spine, smoothed my napkin once more, and lifted my chin. Not because I felt strong, but because if I didn't, I was afraid I might vanish altogether. The dinner continued, forks scraping against porcelain, wine refilling glasses, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just been erased with a single effortless sentence. I sat still, every nerve lit with silent fire, wondering how much longer I could pretend I belonged at a table that had decided long ago I was never really welcome. And though I didn't know it yet, that crack inside me had just let in the first sliver of something far more powerful than hurt: resolve. You don't need to scream to kill someone. A few words can be enough. I sat there in the dining room, hands resting quietly on the folded napkin in my lap, as if still expecting the evening to carry on as normal. It did. Plates were passed, small talk resumed, and wine continued to flow, but none of it seemed real anymore. I had been dismissed, not with a bang, but with a whisper that everyone else seemed to find perfectly acceptable. Out of habit, I nodded when Victoria asked if I wanted more lamb. I smiled when Brandon cracked a joke about venture capitalists. Inside, though, it was like my chest had been hollowed out and left to echo. The rain outside thickened into steady sheets against the windows, blurring the manicured gardens into abstract smudges of green and gray. I watched it absently, letting my mind wander somewhere safer. A memory surfaced without permission. Me, at 10 years old, standing on a school stage clutching a stiff certificate of achievement for the regional math competition. Richard had been in the audience, sitting in the second row, arms crossed. When my name was called, when I received the only award given that night, he had nodded once. No applause, no smile, just a nod. As if I'd done nothing more than fulfill some minor obligation. That nod had haunted me more than any shouting ever could. Now, decades later, here I was again, performing in front of an audience that had already decided the verdict before the show even began. Victoria dabbed her mouth delicately with her napkin and turned to Brandon, her expression softening into maternal pride. "Tell us, sweetheart," she said, voice dripping with encouragement. "What's next for you?" Brandon leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms casually over the chair beside him, owning the space like it owed him something. "Well," he said, glancing at me just briefly enough to make sure I was listening, "Dad and I have been talking. It's official. I'm heading up Project Nova." The words barely landed before Richard was nodding again, the same slow, deliberate gesture of endorsement that had eluded me my entire life. Project Nova, my project. I had built it from nothing, piece by piece, over late nights and weekends sacrificed. I had drawn the first models, recruited the team, fought for the initial funding when everyone else said it was too risky. And now it was Brandon's, just like that. I gripped my water glass tighter, willing my face to stay blank. I could almost hear Victoria's voice in my head. "Composure is the armor of the strong." "Of course," Victoria chimed in, her smile razor-sharp beneath the polish. "Brandon has that natural energy people respond to. It's so important in leadership, you know. People need to feel inspired, not intimidated." Her glance at me was fleeting but surgical. A flick of the eyes, a sweetened poison. I said nothing. I couldn't have trusted my voice if I tried. Brandon shrugged modestly, as if the whole thing embarrassed him. "Elena's great with the numbers," he said generously, "but, innovation needs more than spreadsheets." I wanted to laugh, or scream, or walk out into the rain and never look back. Instead, I smiled faintly, the way you do when you're at a dinner party and realize the hosts have seated you in the wrong century. By the time dessert arrived, a lemon tart so flawless it could have graced a magazine cover, I had decided 2 things. First, I would not beg. Second, I would not break. The evening blurred into polite goodbyes, air kisses, and the soft clinking of glass doors being closed behind me. I walked to my car slowly, the rain soaking through my coat, but I barely felt it. The mansion behind me glowed warmly against the dark, a perfect scene of success built on a foundation I was no longer allowed to touch. The next morning, I arrived at Morgan Enterprises earlier than usual, hoping to bury myself in work before the bruises of last night could settle in too deeply. The lobby gleamed under harsh white lights, sterile and impersonal. I swiped my ID badge at the turnstile. Nothing. A dull red light blinked at me. I tried again. Same result. "Maybe it's the system," I muttered, forcing a small laugh as I caught the guard's wary glance. But I knew better. I signed in manually and rode the elevator up to the executive floor. The usual buzz of assistants and conference calls filled the air, but something about it felt off. Quieter. Colder. I reached for my office door. It opened easily enough, but when I tried logging into my computer, the screen flashed a message I had never seen before. Access denied. Frowning, I tried the shared drive. Same error. I checked my email. My inbox was still there, but empty, stripped clean, like a house after a quiet robbery. My stomach turned, a slow, twisting ache. I called Et. The line rang and rang and rang before disconnecting. I sent a quick text to Maya Carter, my assistant and one of the few people in that building I trusted. Did something happen with my accounts? No reply. I sat there, fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the desk, trying not to let panic take root. It wasn't until an hour later that the email arrived, slipped between automated updates like a snake hiding in tall grass. No subject line, no sender name I recognized. Just a simple attachment, a scanned vendor contract. I opened it, frowning at the unfamiliar company name at the top, and then I saw it. My signature. Perfect. Precise. Exactly how I signed off on documents. Only I had never seen this contract before, had never approved a payment of that magnitude to a vendor I had never spoken to. The edges of my vision darkened, just for a moment as the realization hit. They weren't just erasing me. They were building the gallows and hanging my name on it. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, the faint hum of the office around me fading into static. It wasn't rage that filled me then. It wasn't even grief. It was something colder, something steadier, something that whispered, "Not yet." They didn't just push me out. They were setting the stage for my downfall. That realization settled over me like a second skin as I sat in my office, blinking at the forged contract still glowing on my screen. The lights above hummed faintly, the kind of sterile buzz that used to blend into the background but now felt like an accusation. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket, and walked out into the hallway. Faces turned away. A few quick, guilty glances slid across my path like minnows darting from a predator. I headed straight to HR. The glass walls of the HR office gave away the truth before I even walked in. Cynthia, the director, wouldn't meet my eyes. She shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling and forced a tight smile that didn't reach the corners of her mouth. "I need to understand why my system access was revoked," I said, keeping my tone calm. "I'm not at liberty to discuss ongoing administrative transitions," Cynthia recited, her hands clenching slightly on her desk. "Was it an administrative decision?" I asked, voice even, "or a targeted removal?" She blinked at me, quick and rabbit-like, and looked down at her papers. "I'm sorry, Elena. I can't comment." The script had been written, and she was just another actor following stage directions. I left without slamming the door, though the temptation gnawed at me. On the elevator ride down, I pulled out my phone and dialed the only number I trusted in that moment. Rachel Monroe answered on the second ring. "Elena," she said, her voice brisk but warm. "What's going on?" "I need your eyes on something," I said, already forwarding the contract file. "Vendor agreement forged under my name. I didn't authorize it." There was a pause, the faint click of a mouse, and then a low whistle. "This isn't just sloppy," Rachel said. "This is criminal." I exhaled slowly, gripping the handrail of the elevator like it might anchor me. "How bad?" "If they push this narrative," she said carefully, "you're not just getting fired, you're getting buried." The words were sharp, but they didn't cut the way I expected. Maybe because part of me had already seen the blade coming. I didn't go back to my office. I didn't even go home right away. Instead, I drove around the city for a while, letting the windshield wipers set the rhythm for my thoughts. The skyline of Charlotte blurred against the night, familiar streets turning foreign. Everything felt smaller now, sharper. By the time I parked in front of my building, night had fully taken over. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, unlocked my door, and stepped into the silence of my apartment. Minimalist, clean lines, pale wood floors. It had always been my refuge, my way of controlling at least one space in my life. Tonight, it would be my war room. I kicked off my heels and pulled the blinds closed. Then I set my laptop on the kitchen island, spread out the manila folders I kept tucked away for emergencies, and began the slow, methodical work of saving myself. First, the trust documents. My grandfather, Thomas Morgan, had believed in legacy, not lineage. He set up a financial trust tied to the family business, but he made one critical decision others had long forgotten. Control of disbursements didn't go to the eldest son. It went to the most qualified heir. And thanks to a quirk of timing and a series of certifications and leadership milestones I had achieved, but Brandon never bothered with, that heir was me. For years, the trust had funded critical operations at Morgan Enterprises, salaries, vendor contracts, bonuses for executives. The board assumed the money would always flow. No one had thought to check who had their hand on the faucet. I read through the clauses again, fingers tracing the familiar legalese. Primary controller retains the right to pause disbursements at their discretion, pending review of financial mismanagement or evidence of malfeasance. In other words, if I saw fraud, and I had every right to stop the flow. My heart didn't race. My palms didn't sweat. If anything, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. I opened a secure portal linked to the trust. My login still worked. Another oversight from the family who had spent so much time trying to erase me that they forgot where the real eraser was kept. There, under a simple drop-down menu, sat a button labeled Pause Disbursements. No fireworks, no alarms, just a quiet choice. I hovered the cursor for a moment, thinking of my grandfather's voice. Paper trails are the real swords in business, and the sharpest sword is silence. I clicked. Confirmation appeared. Funds. Paused. I leaned back, letting the silence of my apartment press against me like a second skin. The war had begun, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Hours later, as I sat cross-legged on the couch, surrounded by open files and empty coffee cups, my phone buzzed. A text from Brandon. "You need to fix this, now." No greeting, no explanation. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the last remnants of fear flicker and die out. They thought I was still the girl waiting for a nod of approval. They had no idea what they had created. I set my phone face down on the coffee table, closed my laptop, and finally allowed myself a small, cold smile. This was just the beginning. Money moves the world. When you stop it, the whole machine trembles. Monday morning dawned heavy and gray, the clouds hanging low over Charlotte like a warning no one could quite name. I sat at my kitchen island, a steaming mug of coffee cooling beside my laptop, watching the financial dashboard of Morgan Enterprises flicker quietly on my screen. The trust disbursements were frozen. The operating account was dry. All that remained was the slow, inevitable unraveling. Across town, inside the marble and glass tower that bore my family's name, the first cracks were beginning to show. I didn't need to be there to feel it. Maya kept me updated with carefully worded texts that slipped past company firewalls like whispered secrets. Payroll systems flashing red, no salaries posted, vendors calling nonstop, logistics threatening to pull contracts, Brandon pacing like a caged animal. I sipped my coffee, feeling a calmness I hadn't known I was capable of. It didn't take long for the panic to grow teeth. By mid-morning, the executive floor resembled less a command center and more a disaster zone. Phones rang unanswered. Assistants huddled in corners, whispering frantic speculations. Department heads stormed into the CFO's office, demanding explanations. But there were none that could be offered. Money was supposed to move silently, invisibly, like blood through veins. When it stopped, everything noticed. Brandon tried to rally, of course. Maya told me he burst into the main conference room around 10, throwing around words like glitch and technical error, promising everyone it would be fixed by noon. But noon came and went, and the only thing that moved was fear. Richard summoned the CFO, Gareth, into his office. Maya couldn't hear the details, but she described the shouting that echoed through the hallway, the red flush creeping up Gareth's neck, the way assistants scattered before they could be pulled into the crossfire. They ran system diagnostics. They audited third-party payment processors. They rebooted servers. None of it mattered, because the problem wasn't in the system. It was in the structure. And I held the key. Around 2, my phone buzzed again. They're calling an emergency board meeting. Richard looks ready to tear the place down. I smiled, just a little. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was recognition, the kind you feel when the math finally balances, when the last puzzle piece clicks into place. The Morgan Empire wasn't built on innovation or leadership. It was built on the silent assumption that people like me would always stay silent, stay loyal, stay in our place. And now, with nothing more than a few clicks and a signature they had never thought to question, I had taken away the one thing they had never imagined losing: control. At 3:15, Brandon called. I let it ring. At 3:20, he texted, "You have to help us fix this. Please. Dad's losing it. Vendors are threatening lawsuits." For a brief moment, I stared at the message, feeling the ghost of the old pull. The need to fix things, to be the reliable one, to smooth over their messes. But that version of me was gone. Instead, I typed a reply, slow and deliberate. "See you at the boardroom." I hit send and set the phone down gently on the counter. Outside, the clouds finally gave way to a hard, driving rain that hammered against the windows, drowning the city in gray. Inside, my apartment remained still, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and the steady, certain beat of my heart. I didn't pace. I didn't fidget. I simply waited. Because when you control the purse, you don't need to shout. You just have to wait for the kingdom to come looking for you. There's a special silence in a room when everyone knows the emperor has no clothes. I stepped off the elevator and into the executive floor, heels clicking sharply against the polished marble. The reception area, usually humming with low conversation and perfumed with fresh flowers, was eerily still. Only the muted thunder rolling outside reminded me that the world was still turning. The boardroom door loomed ahead, its heavy oak panels looking more like gates to a courtroom than a place where deals were struck and fortunes were shaped. I smoothed the front of my jacket, feeling the comforting weight of the leather folder tucked under my arm. Inside, the air was tight, coiled with nervous energy. Richard sat at the head of the long table, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the tendons straining in his neck. Brandon slouched 2 seats away, pale and twitchy, his usual arrogance crumbling at the edges. Victoria sat still and composed near the end, her hands folded neatly in her lap, expression unreadable. Around them, the board members murmured in low tones, stealing glances between each other, suspicion thickening with every passing minute. I walked to the far end of the table, choosing a seat directly opposite Richard. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. For a few breaths, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sounds were the faint clicking of laptop keys and the soft patter of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Finally, Richard cleared his throat and leaned forward. "I've called this emergency session to address what we believe is a system-wide technical failure," he said, voice steady but forced. "A disruption in the trust disbursements. It's being handled. There's no cause for panic." A few board members exchanged wary looks. One woman, a senior executive from a logistics partner, crossed her arms tightly, her knuckles whitening. I waited until Richard finished his rehearsed statement before opening my folder and laying out the first document carefully on the table. "I'm afraid it's not a system error," I said, my voice calm but carrying clearly across the room. "It's financial mismanagement and deliberate fraud." Silence. The kind of silence that feels like a dropped glass just before it shatters. Richard's nostrils flared. "That's a serious accusation," he said, the words grinding between his teeth. I nodded. "It is." I turned the first page toward the board members. "This is a vendor contract," I said, "approved under Brandon Morgan's authority. Payment routed to a shell company registered to an offshore address. No services rendered. No legitimate business activity." Gasps rippled around the room. A few board members leaned closer, reading the small print, eyes widening as they scanned the figures. I laid down the next document. "And here," I continued, "is the authorization for a second payment, also fraudulent, also linked to Brandon, this time with Richard's counter-signature." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, the large monitor at the end of the room blinked to life. Rachel Monroe's face appeared via video link, calm and precise as always. "Good afternoon," she said crisply. "I've reviewed the documentation Elena provided. The evidence indicates clear violations of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of trust funds, and conspiracy to commit corporate fraud." The room seemed to shrink around Richard and Brandon. I could almost see the walls closing in. Rachel continued, her voice clinical. "Per corporate bylaws and regulatory compliance standards, the board has an obligation to act immediately upon credible evidence of financial misconduct." A heavy-set board member, usually one of Richard's staunchest allies, cleared his throat awkwardly. "I move to suspend Richard Morgan and Brandon Morgan pending full investigation," he said. "I second," someone else added almost immediately. Richard's face flushed deep red. He stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is a setup," he barked. "A vendetta." No one moved to support him. Victoria remained seated, her gaze fixed straight ahead, as if she weren't even in the same room. The chairman, an older gentleman with wire-framed glasses, banged a small gavel he kept on hand for formalities. "All in favor?" he asked. Hands rose, one after another, without hesitation. I didn't raise mine. I didn't need to. The verdict had already been sealed. Richard slumped back into his chair, defeated, breathing heavily. Brandon buried his head in his hands, mumbling something no one cared enough to decipher. The meeting dissolved into hushed conversations and a flurry of administrative motions. Richard and Brandon would be escorted out quietly, their access suspended, their titles stripped, pending further action. I sat still, absorbing the moment not with glee, but with a deep, marrow-level relief. This wasn't revenge, it was reckoning. When the formalities ended, people began to gather their papers and shuffle toward the door. Victoria stood slowly, her movements graceful, deliberate. She walked past me, pausing just long enough to lean down and whisper in my ear. "You may win the company," she said softly, her breath cool against my skin, "but you'll never win the family." Then she walked away, heels clicking a perfect rhythm across the cold marble. I sat there a moment longer, staring at the empty chairs, the scattered papers, the ghosts of the empire they had tried to build without me. Outside, the storm broke fully open, rain pounding the city like a cleansing drum, and inside, for the first time in a very long while, I finally exhaled. Sometimes winning means walking away without looking back. Spring unfolded across Charlotte like a slow exhale, softening the hard edges winter had left behind. The trees along the avenues blushed pink and white, their blossoms bright against the clear sky. And for the first time in longer than I cared to remember, I moved through the city without feeling like I was carrying a secret weight. My office was on the same executive floor, but it might as well have been a different world. The dark paneling was gone, replaced by light oak and wide windows that let the sunshine spill across the open space. Green plants thrived in every corner. The heavy closed doors that once separated leadership from the people they led had been replaced with glass walls and open desks, a different kind of empire. I stood by the window, watching as the city moved steadily below, and thought back to my very first business class. The professor had stood before a lecture hall filled with restless undergrads and said, almost as an afterthought, "True leadership is service, not domination." At the time, I had written it down without much thought. Today, it was the cornerstone of everything I wanted to build. Maya Carter knocked once and stepped into the office, a bright file folder tucked under her arm. No longer my assistant. Today, she was Director of Strategic Initiatives, a role she had earned 10 times over. "Morning, CEO," she said with a grin. "Morning, Director," I replied, matching her smile. The team we had assembled over the past few months was young in spirit, diverse in experience, and most importantly, willing to question the old ways. Former employees who had once been pushed aside found their way back, bringing with them a stubborn kind of loyalty, the kind you couldn't buy or force. Instead of clinging to the old guard, we launched a startup incubator project within the company, investing directly in the people who had ideas but never the platform to share them. It wasn't about legacy anymore. It was about building something that could stand without needing a name carved into stone. Outside these walls, the headlines told their own story. Former executive faces fraud, charges amid corporate shakeup. Richard Morgan announces retirement following board restructure. Brandon had faded into the footnotes, his courtroom dramas unfolding far from the bright lights he used to chase. Richard's resignation had been dressed up with polite language and staged photographs, but everyone knew the truth. I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching them fall, only a quiet acknowledgement that some endings were necessary. Later that afternoon, as the office buzzed around me with the low hum of real work, the kind that mattered, I opened my laptop and composed a message to the entire company. Subject, ours always. This company was never just theirs. It was always ours. It lived in the late nights you spent solving problems no one else saw. It grew in the quiet victories no headline ever celebrated. It survived because of you. And from today forward, you will never be invisible again. I hit send and leaned back, letting the weight of it settle in the space between breaths. The sun shifted across the floor, casting long, warm lines over the desk. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the soft hum of life stirring back into the bones of a place that had once felt hollow. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't vindicated. I was free. A small chime interrupted my thoughts. A text message, simple and unassuming. I glanced at my phone and read, "Thank you for seeing us when no one else did." No name, no signature. but I didn't need either. Some victories are loud and public. Some are quiet and private, blooming in the spaces where dignity and purpose finally return. I set the phone down, turned back to the window, and watched as the city stretched toward the horizon, wide, open, and full of new beginnings. Standing there, with sunlight pouring into the new office, I realized winning wasn't about defeating anyone. It was about finding peace with myself after all the storms I had weathered. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are the ones for our own dignity, and the quiet victories are the ones that truly matter. In life, true leadership isn't about power or pride. It's about lifting others up, even when no one sees it. When we choose compassion over control, when we see the invisible and hear the unheard, we don't just rebuild companies, we rebuild trust. After all, the strongest empires are the ones built on kindness, not fear. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share your own journey because sometimes your voice might be exactly the light someone else needs.